I think that's borne out by the evidence.
All right. Better give
All
it
right,
back to our host here.
YouTubers can now come in. I don't know why I'm some in your face here. I suppose I thought I was going to be on a webinar, but it's nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
All right,
Dear
folks, give instructions.
Dear professors, Spence, if we are ready, I'm going to start YouTube Live. Then we can start. Let me start. Yes, it has started, and Anil, you can give a brief explanation.
Okay, so welcome, dear participants, and welcome, Professor Spence. So now I will give a short introduction, and then I will continue. So I will give an introduction about dear guest, Professor Michael Spence. So firstly, of course, dear participants in Zoom and also in YouTube, welcome to our departmental seminar. So this week, we are going to welcome dear Professor Michael Spence from New York University. As most of you know, Professor Spence is one of the Nobel Prize winners in 2001, together with George Akerlof and Joseph Stiglitz for their analysis of markets with asymmetric information. And also in the world of economics, many of us know him actually with his PhD dissertation titled Market Signaling and Following Signaling Models that we see in general our microeconomics and game theory classes. So also, dear Spence is a member of the American Economic Association and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometrics Society. By the way, Professor Spence also received John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economics Association in 1981. So he has a really fascinating career along with significant numbers of books and articles. So, dear Professor, hosting you is a really very big honor for us. Today, different from our previous departmental seminars, we will continue in a questions and answers format. So, as usual, you can ask your questions by raising hands and turning your microphones on. Also, we will follow the chat boxes in Zoom and YouTube. You can write your questions in chat boxes. Then I will direct questions in order. Before starting, I first want to give the floor to head of the economics department, Professor Dr. Fazıl Kayıkçı, for an opening speech. So Fazıl Hocam.
Welcome to everybody. Professor Spence, it is a great honor to see you between us and listening to you face to face in Zoom and finding some answers to our questions. Welcome again.
Thank you.
And if you wish, we can start.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, as everybody, I think, would say. You know, it would be really nice if we were doing this in person, even though, you know, the digital technologies have helped us kind of keep these interactions going. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you. So let me just say, I'm going to say a few words at the start. I've prepared a lot of slides, but I'm not going to go through them all unless subjects come up. So I'd like to talk about really two things. You know, one is these major transformations that we're, you know, entering into. And the second one is, you know, how are we doing in, you know, the so-called post, whenever it is, post-pandemic kind of growth patterns in the global economy. And there's challenges associated with that. So I thought I'd start with that. And then we can go wherever you want. We can go to the energy transition. We can go to the complex aspects of the digital transformation. In terms of subject matter, I mean, the reason I am spending a fair amount of time, you know, thinking about the kind of digital economy is precisely because it relates to, in part, to the informational structure of markets. I mean, we're seeing reasonably dramatic changes in the informational structure of markets, and informational asymmetries being closed, you know, with big data and artificial intelligence and so on. So for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, we could kind of move in that direction. But let me, just plow through a little bit of this first. I think this will work. Well, maybe it won't. Give me a second. I might have to get rid of this thing. No. All right. All right. I got to see you. All right. So this is kind of obviously overly simple, but I think of the world we're living in as extraordinarily complex, and consists of at least 4, probably more, major transformations. And each of these has multiple dimensions. So the first one, which has been underway for a long time, but is now kind of front and center in terms of the way the global economy operates, is the shift of the center of gravity of the global economy to Asia. And you can define Asia as expansively as you want, but the simple truth is this is going on. It changes power relationships, both economic and other. It's probably an important reason why we have to sort of rewrite the rules of engagement that worked for a fairly long time after World War II. So that's one. The second one is a kind of digital transformation, which you see every day. So it's not going to be a surprise. But I think what the kind of most sort of forceful way to say it is we are in probably the early stages of moving a very substantial fraction of the sort of underpinnings of our economy on its essentially digital foundations, some of which are platforms and some of which are just plumbing. And the pandemic dramatically accelerated some aspects of that. And so we probably, and that has both challenges and big opportunities associated with it. And I'll say a few words about that. The third one is less talked about. I mean, by less talked about, I mean, I think it's not that there's nobody interested in this third item. It's just that it's not kind of a general subject in the population at large, but there is, something that's quite revolutionary going on in biomedical science, in biology, in agricultural science, and in healthcare. And you saw a glimpse of it in the development of vaccines at a pace we'd never seen before. And you got a glimpse of the technologies that are driving that. One of the leading vaccine producers was actually working on immunotherapies for cancer. And I'm told, again, this is not my field, but I'm told that we're not very far away from being able to produce therapeutics, medicines that are specifically tailored to a specific individual in this kind of category of thing. And the final is, the one that kind of virtually everybody knows about, but doesn't know how to do, which is the energy transition. And so, if there's time at the end and we've exhausted whatever subjects you want to spend, I think these transformations are being driven by really powerful, what I call tools and technologies. And what's distinctive about this era is not just that these tools exist. I mean, one of them is DNA sequencing. But what's distinctive is not DNA sequencing. We've had that around for 30 years or more, and we've understood the structure of DNA for a lot longer than that, since the work of Watson and Crick. What's distinctive is it isn't very costly anymore, and it's widely available to virtually the entire panoply of people working in the biomedical sciences, and that's just an example. Anyway, I sort of collect these tools, so if there's time, I'll show them, the ones I've collected to you. This is really annoying. So you're going to have to give me 1 sec, as I need to move the toolbar. Doc. All right, we'll move it there, and that will give me control over the screen. Okay, and this is just one version of the shift of the global economy. to Asia. But you can, I won't go over this in detail, but you can see, first of it, the shift is definitely toward emerging economies, or what the current set of emerging economies, but that has a very distinct, pattern of moving in the direction, moving east, I guess is a simple way to say it. So we're in a period, I'm going to make some assertions that we may want to discuss later, but I think it's a period of extraordinary, complex, and rapid change. So here are some things that I think are quite likely to happen in the next, decade and a half. First of all, I think there's a reasonable chance, maybe even better than a reasonable chance, that we'll have another.
Professor, sorry for interrupting, but I think, do you sharing something now on the screen?
I thought I was. Have I stopped sharing?
No, we cannot see the screen sharing now.
Okay, then I've got a screen share.
Okay, now we can see.
Is that better?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, I lost it for some reason. Sorry about that. Now I got to go back. Okay, so I think there's going to be a burst of productivity. This is driven mostly by the digital transformation, a little bit by benign aspects of the energy transition. I think not we all, but many countries are, dealing with some form of rising inequality of income and wealth and opportunity and access to, basic services. We have remote populations in a wide range of countries that tend to be underserved because they're not near high density service areas. So the bottom line is, and again, I can give you, lots of examples of this, but probably many of you can too, but there are enormous opportunities in e-commerce, in health, in education, in finance, of creating inclusive growth patterns using powerful digital technologies. And these are really exciting. On the other hand, all of these transformations, like any major transformation, are disruptive, and they will have distributional impacts, both positive but negative. And the distributional impacts are large, and they need to be dealt with if you want to make it less disruptive. But you will also need to deal with them if you want the process to go forward. I mean, sufficiently disruptive things generate resistance, and there are lots of channels for expressing resistance, as we know from studying the growth trajectories of a wide range of countries. I would say this is the fourth item on this list, that artificial intelligence combined with advanced robotics, which AI is part of, which includes sensors, image recognition technology, which is a powerful AI, vision, manual dexterity. I didn't write that down. I think it's a pretty good guess that in 10 to 15 years, and this will happen more or less continuously, manufacturing and a good part of logistics will no longer be labor intensive at all, meaning there will be people there, but there won't be very many. And the vast majority of people in an increasingly large set of economies will be working for some version of a service sector. As a result of that, it won't surprise you to know that the global supply chains for most of the post-war period have been organized around accessing the least mobile resource, right? Which is not money, it's not technology, it's not data. At least up until recently, it's people, right? The least mobile resource at scale is people, and so the global supply chains, even to this day, are organized around using powerful technologies to do it efficiently, organizing, and accessing valuable pools of human capital and integrating them into the global economy. And that's going to still be true in the future, but it won't be true in manufacturing because labor won't be a significant fraction of the costs. And so this will free manufacturing to move around. And this has enormous implications for developing country growth models at various stages of development, for the way global supply chains are put together, There'll be some degree of localization, almost for sure, and so on. In addition, you know, if you live in a country like as James and I do, a very significant fraction of the discussion is, well, what are we going to do about jobs and skills and stuff like that? And that's not a misguided. I think it's a little bit biased in the direction of too much emphasis on that, not enough on some other dimensions of this transformation. So we are going to go through a process of automation, but eventually end up working beside machines. You know, digital machines are essentially going to be augmentation rather than automation at the end of the process, but it will be disruptive on the way through. Now let me talk about, I've got 2 slides and I'm going to spend a little time on talking about the pandemic and the recovery patterns and some challenges that have emerged pretty clearly. So the global economy in the first half of this year was in what I would call very rapid recovery mode. The vaccines rolled out initially in the United States, Israel, the UK, continental Europe had a little trouble catching, you know, the vaccines, but eventually they flowed in. A significant fraction of the emerging economies had vaccine access. This is a cascading process. It was like a queue. So things look pretty good, and the economic data, you know, tended to support that. But since that time, more or less over the summer and into the fall, the picture changed, not completely. We're still in recovery mode in a fair amount of the world, but it's a less rosy picture, and it's a lot slower, and we are slowing down pretty much everywhere. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And I cite these ones in no particular order. And when I make assertions about this, you know, they're invitations to disagree or to question or to go deeper. So I think the climate headwinds have become stronger. The IPCC, the UN, you know, scientific body, issued a really stark report this summer that basically said, you know what, you know, avoiding climate change that window's closed, done. That's over. We're going to have significant climate change, and we'll have a significant climate change for a number of decades. But there's still a big challenge, which is to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, so that in addition to what we've already had, which is significant climate events and impacts, we don't have a catastrophe down the road. And my view is that these climate events in various categories are now sufficiently severe and frequent and global in coverage that we're starting to see macroeconomic events. And there's a small amount of research that's starting in economics that suggests this may be true. One paper that came out of the Federal Reserve System suggested that the climate issues were making downturns, recessions more severe. I don't know. Let me admit I don't know how to evaluate that, but people are taking an interest. You know, 20 years ago, we had severe climate events. We had famines and an occasional drought, but nobody really suggested that we had these things at a scale which would show up in macroeconomic data like growth, GDP, etc. And I think we ought to at least consider the fact that we're at the point where that may very well be true. And that's before you get the potential sort of tipping point type crises, you know, rapid changes in things like sea levels and so on. The President Biden said that 1/3 of Americans in this past year live in counties that have had severe weather events, including floods, fires, etc. And the estimated cost is on the order of $100 billion in rising. $100 billion isn't going to break the bank in the United States, but it's starting to be non-trivial. I guess the one that surprised everybody the most, and I hope generates some really important research, is the supply chain congestion. So everybody knows we've got supply chain congestion, and people are starting to realize that it's going to last well into next year, unless all the estimates are wrong. And I personally think it's going to last well into next year, because I just don't see any way to untangle it. and to eliminate the shortages. So we have, as a result of this, before we kind of diagnose it, we have backlogs, we have rising prices, all over the place, inflation, big shipping costs, etc. So the part of this that wasn't a surprise is the demand surge, which is huge, right? We knew we were going to have a demand surge. Why? Because all the stars lined up. We had huge fiscal programs, in a number of countries, including the United States. We had accommodative monetary policy. They were just extremely reluctant, though they're changing their mind now, to disrupt the recovery prematurely. And we had pent-up demand, and we had huge accumulation in savings, because part of the response to the pandemic on the economic side for countries that had fiscal space was to take balance sheet damage in the household sector and the corporate sector and transfer it to the public sector, to the sovereign. And that wasn't a bad idea. It would probably, at least as I see it, would have done a whole lot more damage if that balance sheet damage that came with a huge contraction had been left in the household sector and the corporate sector. Would lose businesses, people wouldn't be able to spend money and so on. So I don't think that was a bad thing. But anyway, that's one of the things that happened. The thing that came as a surprise, I think, was that the supply chain wasn't more flexible. So we knew, in a way, that it was wound pretty tightly. And I think this is also should be on the research agenda. This is a network, a very complex network that is created in an entirely decentralized fashion. There is no architect of this thing. There is nobody or no entity that is deciding how much capacity it should have, how resilient it is. There just isn't any entity that even remotely is close to that. And it has another property I'll come to in a minute that exacerbates this problem. So it's wound very tightly because that's what the private incentives do. And resilience is a kind of quasi-public good. The pandemic made that worse. Why? Because in the pandemic, everybody went into survival mode, or at least the vast majority of companies went into survival mode. But what do you do when you're in survival mode? You don't carry a pile of inventories that you don't think you're going to need for an unknown period of time, right? So what was wound pretty tightly, in terms of capacity to absorb a kind of shock or a sudden shift in direction, became more tightly wound. And so it's going to take a while to get out of this. In addition, because of the decentralization, you really need a coordinated assault on it. So, policies that affect the port in Long Beach, are pretty important. But until somebody steps in, like the federal government, they're kind of busy doing their own thing. So, this is an anecdote, but I'll tell it anyway. Two friends of mine, one of whom was very knowledgeable about logistics, went out in a boat and looked at the port of Long Beach and discovered the containers were stacked too high, meaning 1, 2, and no more. Okay, that is. And there wasn't any space for more containers. It was part of the congestion problem. So they sent a note to the head of the port and said, you got to stack the containers, more than 2 high. And the head of the port said, we can't. There's an ordinance in Long Beach that says we have to stack the containers just 2 high. And then they sent a note to the mayor of Long Beach and said, you got to get rid of the ordinance. But you just see that kind of, if you just multiply that by something like 10 million, in a highly decentralized thing, and it just doesn't respond very quickly. And finally, not only is there nobody in charge of these networks, but there isn't any way to see what's going on in them. Literally everybody can see bits and pieces. They're anecdotes. There is no database that tells you the condition of the global supply chain. It's way worse than weather forecasting, way worse. We have huge databases and models that allow us to predict, severe weather events, for example. Not all of them, but most of them. There's no capacity of that type. And so there's no way to tell people this system is getting, stretched out of shape or constrained, and allowing them to adapt. Now, I'm not saying that, if you had an AI-driven database that covered a very substantial fraction of the global economy, that you could have avoided the kind of problem that we have now because the demand surge was too large. But it would have helped if people had known there was trouble coming, in the spring, and made their orders for Christmas, in May instead of August, when they discovered they weren't going to be delivered on time, for example, right? So there's some work, I guess. There's some work on understanding how this big behemoth works as a network. And there's some work to be done on, changing its behavior using various tools, including a tool that we haven't always had, which is, it's not impossible to imagine creating an international authority that has that by international agreements has the data to see into this thing. As a result of the supply, we went from, since the great financial crisis, we basically lived in a demand-constrained, a demand-constrained economy for most of the subsequent decade. Meaning there was no sign of inflation. There was never really any question about whether the supply side could keep up with the demand side. So in some sense, this is really, hasn't occurred for a long time because we are now in a supply constrained economy. And we have, as a result, some version of inflation. And the big question mark that's debated by very smart people and policymakers is it transitory, and what does transitory mean, measured in months or years? And finally, if it isn't really short duration, then do expectations change and we get inflation embedded in the system? I'm not a macro economist and certainly not a monetary economist, so I just listen to what other people say. But there's no question that we have a problem. I don't think it's the same problem as in Turkey, but it's a serious problem, and you can see if you read the international press that the Federal Reserve is kind of doing a semi-about face at the moment because they were betting that it was transitory. Having said that, the central banks are in a really tough spot, right? I mean, the last thing, their credibility depends on not letting inflation get out of hand, for sure. On the other hand, the last thing they want to do is cut off the recovery. And they certainly don't want, if they can avoid it, to deal with a demand-supply imbalance in favor of demand by bringing it into balance by killing the demand side. They'd far rather, hope, cross their fingers and hope that the supply side, adjusts to meet the demand. So this aspect of inflationary pressure goes away. And they've kind of placed that bet, and so far they're not winning. And so they're going to be, in a reasonably tough spot. And it's made more complicated by the fact that we've had a very significant increase in sovereign debt globally. We're over 100% of global GDP now. It varies from place to place, but it's a significant enough overhang that the pressure to avoid rapid increases in interest rates that will affect government fiscal conditions, maybe even the financial conditions generally, would be something that they haven't felt for a long time. And so they're sitting there, sort of trying to navigate in a pretty kind of unusual environment and figure out, how to do this. So when I talk to investors, I mean, the single most frequent question is, so what are they actually going to do? Because what they do is going to affect asset prices, in obvious ways. Growth stocks will get hurt because the discount rate hurts them, hurts a stock that has far out earnings, even if they're relatively high growth relative to ones that, produce steady, year to year cash flow. So if you're an investor, probably this tips you a little in the favor of the so-called value stocks rather than the growth stocks, but we'll see. You could have a very big asset reset depending on what happens to interest rates. Now, it hasn't really happened in the markets yet, but it's sort of lurking there in the background. One of the things, I'll just mention two other things because they're, from my point of view, important. The pandemic was a very bad experience from the point of view of distribution, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, basically, the people who either lost their jobs or worked under great stress and considerable danger, on average, were in the lower part of the income distribution. And the rest of us who were able to work online, you know, had considerably less economic impact. Now, it might not have been fun, and families had to wrestle with this. You know, when kids were online in school, I don't mean to say it was a lovely experience for anybody, but it was pretty miserable, you know, for small business owners and whatnot. And it's coming back, but, you know, if you read stories about New York, you'll find that employment in Manhattan is, you know, somewhere between 50 to 60% back. That's way below the national average in the United States. So some places got hit pretty hard. And that's on top of a, you know, a general pattern that most of us think needs to be dealt with, which is rising income and wealth inequality, which has multiple causes that we could spend a lot of time on, and they're subject of really good research and everywhere in the world. And I, at least that part I like, because, you know, if you go back 20 years, there were scholars working on this, but the amount of attention paid to this trend, even though it was underway then, was much, much lower than it is now. So we're at least better armed with, you know, a constructive, you know, serious academic input on dealing with these things. And the other thing that the pandemic did was just produce a massive acceleration in the adoption of a variety of digital technologies. That won't surprise you, but virtually every CEO of a major technology company has said things like, you know, we had 5 years of adoption in 3 months. And so I think this is important to understand, because it's, on the one hand, it'll accelerate a process that was underway, and maybe even make parts of it more difficult, as well as accelerating benefits. But it's also interesting to a behavioral economist, because it reinforces something I think we've all known, which is both individuals and institutions essentially under experiment. We tend to do what worked yesterday, you know, tomorrow, unless we can't. And so the pace of learning on average by conducting experiments is lower. And when you get a big shock like this one, then to some extent you accelerate this because it's forced. And so my best guess is what will emerge from this is, I guess what's interesting about this is you conduct the experiment because you have to, and you, in the case of digital technologies, you use them as a substitute for what was there before. But their natural role is not as a substitute, it's as a complement, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's a complement in business, you know, in the world that we all live in, it's a complement in education. So we're going to end up with, you know, going back to class because the interactions matter with our colleagues and with the students, but we'll be armed with a whole lot of possibilities that we weren't really vaguely, you know, sort of too aware of before, and platforms to extend the reach of the educational thing. And I think you can make almost the same statement almost everywhere you look. I know I have some friends who invested in a company that does essentially appointment scheduling in the healthcare sector. Yeah, the company was doing pretty well. This is pre-pandemic, and this company decided that they had all this data and whatnot, so and not all of these appointments required office visits or visits to the hospital or whatever. And so they sort of stick their toe in the business of telehealth. That was a complete failure. Well, there was absolutely no interest. on the demand side or the supply side. The doctors, thought this was, this idea was rubbish. But interestingly, the people on the other side, for the most part, didn't think it was very interesting either. So it went nowhere until the pandemic. Then all of a sudden we have a burgeoning telehealth sector. We've got unicorns, meaning companies with $1 billion of valuation or more building the kind of infrastructure that makes this work reasonably well. No, is medicine going to shift all to online? No, I mean, it's not even remotely interesting, but it's a big shift, and it's an example of what we're talking about. And the reason I apologize for staying on this, but this is an important characteristic, of our economies that is understood at some level, but its implications, I think, are not well understood. So there's lots of things where there's lots of potential cases where opportunities exist, and the pace of adapting or adopting or taking advantage of them is just way too slow. And in some cases, it's crucial. Now, I'll argue a little later on, if there's time, that in an emerging economy, especially in the kind of early middle income stage, one of the best things you can do to produce inclusive growth patterns is make sure that the mobile internet penetration is high, that the costs to the individual, the users, is low, and the data rates are low. And that typically goes too slowly. There's a few exceptions. China is one, because the telecom companies were state-owned and they knew, or they guessed correctly, that once you build that, that it's not a platform, I don't really know what to call it, but if you have sort of 80% of the population, even if many of them are relatively poor, who have a digital identity and can use the mobile internet at reasonable speeds, which really means 4G, then you built an ecosystem that will produce massive amounts of investment, employment, growth, entrepreneurial activity, and so on. And that's happened all over the world. But you've got to get to that point first. So China's an exception, and I don't have time to do this today, but India is a fascinating exception because it was done largely without the government by Reliance Industries. They're just explosive growth in low cost, high access, high penetration mobile internet in India, literally in the last 5 years. I mean, incrementally, probably 300 to 400 million users in a population of 1.3, 1.4 billion. So the potential is enormous, but I think there is a role for governments to change, to think about how do you change the incentives in this specific area. In the vaccine development, Michael Kramer and others have pointed out that what if the speed really matters, then you basically do something that looks like overinvestment. In the United States, the federal government stepped in and essentially arranged not only to support the vaccine development, but to pre-build the manufacturing facilities, including for companies that were doing vaccines that would ultimately fail. Okay, so with hindsight, it's waste. From the benefit, from foresight, it may look like a pretty intelligent policy. So I think there's a whole lot of interesting research to do on that front. I won't spend any time on China except to say there are significant headwinds there, and it's a big enough economy so that it means it's felt everywhere. They have a uniquely zero tolerance approach to the virus, and right now they're doing it again, so to speak, shutting down or partially shutting down various things. Zero tolerance means basically they shut things down if they detect the case. And this is a significant headwind to the economy, not only in the trade side, but the consumption side, because they, shut it down when there's even a hint of trouble. And no country can completely isolate itself, although China's pretty isolated now. And then they have this over-indebted real estate sector, which they have to deal with. I don't expect a systemic crisis there, but it is a tricky problem. And then they have, I'm sure you've all noticed this, a huge shift in direction with respect to regulation of the technology sector, e-commerce, various aspects of fintech. I mean, they're not an outlier in this. The rest of us are moving kind of in the same direction, not at the same speed. And there are really, really, really important regulatory issues having to do with data security, monopoly power, or its potential misuse, etc. So it's not that that they're kind of going in the opposite direction, but they move so aggressively that they've removed in the tech sector on the order of $1.5 trillion in market cap in the mega platform companies, which is pretty significant. I mean, even in a big economy, I mean, that's a lot of value that went away. So I'll skip VIE. This is global public debt, which you're probably already aware of. These are floods around the world in the first half of 2021. There's a lot of them. They're not everywhere, but I mean, they're not confined to a small number of places, I guess is the fair thing to say. This is from your own country, I guess, up near the Black Sea, earlier actually not that long ago, right? Anyway, and that's not unique at all. We just had tornadoes in what's called Tornado Alley in the United States, which kind of runs from somewhere near where James is now, kind of in a sort of northeast direction. And these are getting more frequent and more severe. We've had tornadoes forever, but we don't usually have one that kind of mows down towns on a 250-mile trip up through the southeastern part of the United States. Again, they're just examples, but I think, the point is, it's with us. This is your economy, since you know it very well. I'll skip this. I would say what this thing is over on the right-hand side, if you can see it, is the exchange rate. I don't think that's ideal. It's not what you want to see most days. And probably there's a mirror image picture that looks like inflation, which probably needs to be under control. But overall, I mean, your own economy looks to an outsider like it's in pretty good shape. This growth is not all that bad, although after the great financial crisis where we all took a hit, it's been declining a little bit. And this is the pandemic. So I think you can expect a reasonably robust recovery. You're vaccinated at a relatively high level, like 60% are completely vaccinated, and a larger fraction have had at least one dose, and you're starting to give people booster shots. So, there's a ways to go. That's, by the way, the same number you'll find in the United States. We have we're kind of divided on the question of the value of vaccines in the United States, and so there's a fair amount of resistance, and it's not a small number. I mean, I live in Italy, and we have resistance, but it's a much, much smaller minority. It's pretty noisy, so you can watch the news and see the police fighting with the anti-vax folks, but it's not, we're up around 80%, I would guess. And hopefully you'll get there. But I am particularly, for the reasons I mentioned before, interested in how the internet's doing, how highly penetrated it is, especially the mobile internet, which is 15 years old. The first iPhone came out in 2007. It's really the start of the mobile internet. And the characteristics I mentioned before that, create this opportunity for dramatic, growth in entrepreneurial activity, investment, unicorns, growth companies. So this looks pretty impressive, actually. And the mobile internet numbers aren't bad either. And this now projects out to 2026. So you're here at about 70, according to the data I was able to access, at about 77%. So this is you know, the opportunity that's created by, you know, widespread use of the mobile internet at reasonable costs looks like it's largely in place. Now, these are the data rates, so they're clearly fast enough to support, you know, e-commerce, streaming and stuff, and it's probably most places in the country pretty reliable. You have the same problem virtually everybody in the world does, which is the mega platforms, including the social media, are for the most part not domestic companies. Now, there's some e-commerce exceptions. You have at least two large, you know, powerful e-commerce companies, and that's a good thing. I don't know about cloud computing, though it's important because I couldn't get any really reliable information on it. But the only two places these big platforms reside right now is in the United States and China. And basically we all use them. This is true, by the way, of Europe, which is a huge economy when you put it all together, but it's fragmented. And for whatever combination of reasons, we are not. I think this is, by the way, a problem. I mean, there are real benefits of having huge cloud computing systems, the spin-offs that go with that, and mega platforms that are centers of innovation in things like artificial intelligence and the application of the of AI theory to particular applications. So, but anyway, that's the state of the world, and so this brings me to development issues and priorities, and I think I'm going to stop here. Well, maybe I won't stop quite here. I'll do one more thing. This is my friends in the private equity world who invest in growth companies collected this data. This is slightly out of date, but you can see something that, you know, I don't think anybody completely expected, which is, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, you could count on the fingers of both your hands the number of centers of, you know, vigorous entrepreneurial activity, right? There were 3 or 4 or 5 in the United States. You know, there were a growing number in a number of other countries, including especially China. There's a bunch of them in India now. And in business process outsourcing and so on, you had some interesting activity. It's become completely global. I mean, and I think we're at the start of this rather than the end. You know, this is unicorns, which, you know, are companies that acquire $1 billion valuation frequently before they go public. So the United States and China are still pretty prominent, but India is there at 31. India created 31 unicorns, or has 31 companies that became unicorns this year in 2021. And it's not confined to the big economies. So you have Israel as a kind of tech powerhouse, etc. Now, where are you? I think you're about to join this club. So you have 5 right now, including 2 gaming companies. But there's a pipeline that suggested in the things I read that you're going to end up with another 10 in the relatively near future. Anyway, so the bottom line is you have, I think, the makings of some pretty important growth engines in this sector, and are going to participate in this global pattern of entrepreneurship activity. If you ask yourself the question, what's causing it? One is the characteristics of the digital technologies. You know, they're basically low entry barrier, you know, higher fixed costs, very low marginal cost. They scale relatively easily, you know, so you can get into the business and try out them. Many companies fail or don't turn into, you know, high growth companies and become huge. But that's not a problem, you know, because then they can go on and try it again. So that's part of it. And the other thing is that the ecosystems, you know, the financing, the knowledgeable financing, the complementary resources that support entrepreneurial activity, those are all spreading globally, right? So, you know, you could find, again, 10 years ago, you would find growth companies, growth-oriented investing types, venture capital, equity, in the United States, and you'd find a few different ones in Europe and not much anywhere else. And now they're all operating globally. And there's new entrants, the venture capitalists are entering the growth equity space, etc. So you have a kind of unique, I think, kind of pattern of globalization in a critical area, dynamic area. So it's pretty exciting. I think we're, as I said, I think we're at the start of this rather than the end. So who do I give the floor back to so we can have a chat? Anil? Who?
Me.
Me. Okay.
So thank you. It was a great introduction. Now we have guests both in YouTube and Zoom. I think we can take questions if we have some.
Maybe so I can see you, I'll stop screen sharing. Right there. Maybe while people are thinking, I'll just say a word about why the digital technologies are interesting from the point of view of the informational structure of markets. It actually comes in multiple dimensions. So the part that we've known about for years is that, you can expand the market opportunities essentially for people because digital technologies, really don't care much about distance and delays are pretty short. And that's an important part of the inclusiveness aspect of the growth pattern. So if there's studies done in China about the impact of e-commerce and the mobile payment system and whatnot, and what those studies indicate is that the impact is A, large, and B, it's bigger in the agricultural sector and third and fourth tier cities, right? Why? Because it's not competing with a full panoply of previous existing services that you find in the major cities. So e-commerce is probably a nice addition in Istanbul, but I imagine there's parts of Turkey, as there are in every country, where it's sort of more interesting. And that's just e-commerce. You've got, because of the breakthroughs in image recognition, you can detect skin cancer with images using an AI system. This has been demonstrated in a couple of times. Two kids at Stanford did this in collaboration with dermatologists. I mean, it's hard work because you need a training data set, and the dermatologists have to figure out what the AI got right and wrong. But it's a perfect example of this. So most AI systems are evaluated initially on whether they beat humans or not, right? Whether it's image recognition or playing chess or Go or something. But that's not the most interesting thing, but the most interesting thing is that they add value somewhere. And for those of us who live in major cities, you could argue that, we're still going to go to the dermatologist. I don't care if there's an AI that, is 90% as good at preliminary screening. But 70% of the world's population doesn't live anywhere near a dermatologist, right? And then you start to realize that the big impact isn't whether you beat the dermatologist, it's whether you can extend this aspect of preventive primary care to a vastly larger number of people that are loose in the earth and living in various places. So it's a continuum, but there's a lot of people who are, in the language of development economics, low access, right? Which roughly means, they're not surrounded by a wide range of services, whether it's education or primary health care or a whole lot of other things. And now we have these tools that, used properly and responsibly, can kind of close these gaps. Let me say one other dimension of this, and then if anybody's interested, we can go into it more. But one of the things that happens in the digital economy is you get huge collections of data, but more or less automatically as a result of the digital economy's functioning. And once you have that data, you can turn loose artificial intelligence systems on it. And once again, what has happened in China and other places is that you find that people who basically don't exist from the point of view of the existing financial system. They can't get insurance, they can't get credit. They're too small to make it economic for the traditional banking system to deal with. They don't have any collateral, right? And you can access and make money on these groups of people using essentially the data they generate as they participate in the economy. And this happens through e-commerce, but it especially happens if the mobile payment systems are almost ubiquitous. Now, look, I mean, everybody knows, whether we're talking about gene editing, or AI and big data systems, that there's risks, right? Somebody can misuse this data, or there could be biased, or a whole lot of other things that are serious subjects of discussion, academic research, and regulation. But nevertheless, the responsibly used and regulated, you have the potential to really extend the reach of the economic and financial system to people who struggled to be part of it before. So just two examples, then I'll stop.
I think the Professor Fazıl Kayıkçı has a question, and also after that we have another question in the chat box.
Okay.
Please.
Professor Spence, thank you very much again for your wonderful presentation. We have benefited much. I am going to ask a question about Turkish economy, as it is expected.
Fair enough.
As you have mentioned in your notes, Turkish lira has depreciated throughout the year, more than 80%. And we have an inflation. According to official records, inflation is 21%. However, Central Bank Republic of Turkey has been decreasing interest rates continuously, and today it has decreased to 14%. And the government declared that they try new type of economic policy. How do you evaluate this policy?
I mean, I think it's a mistake, but I mean, I'm not alone in thinking that. I mean, you sometimes when you get in a situation like this, you have to shock the economy, and I would think the central bank would have to tighten. I mean, the only way you can get away with this kind of thing is if you have a situation which Turkey does not have, which is a relatively closed capital account, right? I mean, so there were times in the China case, for example, in which the capital account was sufficiently, I don't mean completely closed, but I mean managed to the point, where you could, if the economy needed, look at, you have Mundel's work in the impossible, trinity, right? So if you have an open capital account, then basically you're stuck. So the answer, if you want to control the exchange rate with respect to sort of competitive conditions, and you want to control the interest rate domestically, then you have to have some controls in the capital account. But you don't, I don't think, or at least not many, and not enough. So that means, I think you have to, and there are good reasons for that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that one should sort of go the direction of cutting, sort of partially shutting down the relation with the rest of the global financial system. And look, I'm not an expert, but I mean, it seems to me, inflation at these levels penalizes poor people, wherever they are. You just don't want to let it go on. And, we went through this in the United States with somewhat less extreme inflation in the post Jimmy Carter Volcker era. And Paul Volcker, with grudging support from President Reagan, clamped down on the money supply, and he drove the prime, interest rate up to about 20%. Now that didn't last very long, but but it by most historians' account beat kind of inflation and inflationary institution and pressures out of the system. We had at that time embedded inflation, meaning wage price spirals, and expectations were consistent with that, so it kind of worked. That's true in some other parts of the world. I don't know Turkey well enough to know whether those dynamics work regularly. I know they do in parts of Latin America. And then basically what Volcker said is, go ahead, raise your prices and raise your wages and incomes, but I'm not raising the money supply, so we'll just see what happens. And everybody knew what was going to happen, right? We had a huge recession, and then the inflation went away. I think you have to get rid of it. It isn't as if monetary policy is incapable of pulling this off, right? I think one of the things we learned in the last 10 years is monetary policy is at least questionable in terms of its ability to raise inflation. But most people don't really doubt that they have the power to lower it if they have to at considerable cost in the short term in terms of the economy. So, our central banks are trying to avoid this, but I think they're getting backed into a corner. Maybe not the ECB, the European Central Bank. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, because then they seem to be on a track, sort of accepting the inflation. But I can imagine our German friends eventually may revolt or something, because inflation's running at 6% in Germany now. Now, if they're right and it turns out to be transitory and it all goes away, then that's fine. Then we'll be bailed out and everybody will feel good about it. But the betting odds aren't in that direction anymore. I don't know. Maybe some of your colleagues disagree with this and think maybe you should just let it run. But I think the majority view of outsiders is it's in an otherwise healthy economy with many sort of strengths. It's a pattern you don't want to let run for too long. What else is on your mind? I don't want this to all be on what's on my mind. What you can talk about what you're worried about, right? The mass?
So, dear professor, can you see the questions in the chat box?
Oh, okay. No, yeah, I should. Okay, here.
So from yes, there's a from Brock,
okay.
Brock Eprimez, Musa Can Besli, and Rude Bulkud. There are 3 questions.
Okay, no, let me tackle that. So I was just, sitting on my hands waiting for somebody to pipe up. Okay.
So I'm also following the questions in YouTube chat. I will also direct them to you.
Okay.
And also I see the Professor Ali Khan. You're rising. Yeah. I will give floor to you.
Right. No. Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. Look.
So you can answer in the questions in the chat box in an order.
No, all of them. Okay, I'll do that all. Professor Ali Khan, why don't you go ahead?
Professor Spence, I am an outsider. I don't know if I am part of the U. I am sitting here in Baltimore, and so I will put my hand down and let you talk about the Turkish economy. But at some point, if there is time, I would also like to ask you about curriculum development and heterodox economics, to which this whole seminar is addressed. But not now. Please go ahead and answer the questions of the Turkish colleagues.
Okay, we'll get to that. So developed economies have the necessary service sector to absorb the labor shed from deindustrialization. But what can developing countries, economies that do not have the necessary service sector do to provide for the low-skilled workers who won't be absorbed? So this is a really important question. And let me preface the answer by saying I don't think anybody knows the answer. So, first of all, who's vulnerable? Who's vulnerable The answer, probably the countries that, in the post-war experience, had an important part of their early growth trajectory associated with labor-intensive, process-oriented manufacturing and assembly, mostly for export, because low-income countries don't have enough domestic demand to kind of run this engine. And I would say, by the time you're in the, middle to upper middle range, I mean, Turkey's a very high. I mean, I don't know why the World Bank classifies Turkey as a middle-income country. Anyway, that doesn't make sense. So then the question is, will this growth engine continue to work? And if what I said before about manufacturing and assembly, becomes digitally capital intensive and not labor intensive over time, then that will undercut that growth engine. And then the question is, well, so a part of the answer to this question is, so what are the growth engines going to be? And specifically, are there any growth engines that plausibly leverage global demand and technology, which were the core characteristics of the kind of pre-digital era growth? So what we saw, for most of the post-war period, is the country would take off like Japan, and they would, their incomes would go up, and then the labor-intensive stuff was passed on, to Korea and the Taiwanese economy. And then there was another handoff to China and so on, and another one to Vietnam. I mean, they're overlapping, but you can see clearly the pattern. This is what the Japanese call the flying geese model. Anyway, the geese may not be able to fly indefinitely. And I would say the big challenge is in the lower income countries, not because there's no alternatives, but there's no obvious alternative that has the same power to generate growth and employment. So what are the alternatives? So some of them are digital, right? But it's going to take a different collection of human capital and a fairly substantial upfront investment in that human capital and in some other aspects of infrastructure to get there. It's like taking the bottom two steps of the ladder away, is the only kind of realistic assessment I've seen. By and large, I think middle income countries are already building, the service sector is coming to dominate anyway, or at least it's growing very fast, and it doesn't take very long. I mean, even a manufacturing powerhouse like China, the service sectors now dominate, and that's just driven by domestic demand. So once you're at that point, I think, most of these things are, for the most part, positive rather than the negative. Nobody's exempt from, the disruptiveness. Anyway, that's kind of my assessment on that front. Big problem in the low income and lower middle income countries. And the pandemic didn't help, because whatever fiscal space they had got used up, dealing with economic effects of the pandemic. How about the usage of cryptocurrencies, Henley, and NFTs? Okay. So I'll just say one thing about NFTs. I don't get it. I mean, who the hell would want to buy one of those? But anyway, well, certainly not me. Cryptocurrencies, at least up until the present, so I want to be careful here. We are going to have digital currencies that are owned and operated by the central banks. And that's a natural process, of the financial sector moving over to the digital side, including the payment sector. But that's it'll be a fiat currency, right? There's an underlying technology that's really important in the cryptocurrency area, which is blockchain, right? And I can think, there's a growing number of applications of blockchain in central banks, engaging with each other in secure transactions. There's a report in the last couple of days that HSBC and Wells Fargo Bank are going to do process their interbank transactions using blockchain, which really means end running, the centralized Fed run clearing exchanges. So that's coming, and in the supply chain area, one of the huge advantages of blockchain is it gives you an supposedly, I suspect this is largely right, unalterable record of what's happened, including where everything's been, right? That's extremely difficult to achieve in a decentralized world and without a technology like blockchain that basically does it automatically. Having said that, when I was in school, a currency was a store of value and a medium of exchange. I don't see how an asset that changes its value by 30% in a week can be thought of as a store of value. So I view cryptocurrencies as an asset class, basically. And maybe some of them will turn out to be interesting to some investors. Maybe if they're restricted in supply, there'll be inflation hedges. I think we're going to conduct experiments. Now, I'm a little surprised at the uptake so far, to be honest with you, because I have relatively little interest in this as opposed to the blockchain. But the only place a cryptocurrency is a real currency is in the illegal part of the global economy, because it works for them, kind of hides the transactions from, any centralized scrutiny, when they run through. And they don't, it's a wonderful, alternative to cash. So anyway, I don't mean to be too negative, but I think it's an asset class and a currency for, money laundering and stuff like that. But I don't honestly see a scenario in which it becomes a major currency in a major economy in the world. And furthermore, I don't think the central banks would let it happen. Okay. A majority of the currently in use US currency has been produced after the pandemic outbreak. Well, that's new to me. Yet the US economy chose to hold strong. What is the reason? I'm not sure I completely understand this question. It's true, we have a pile of liquidity flowing around, including, the American currency. And at least some people believe in this modern monetary theory, which is there's no limit on the fiscal side as long as the central bank keeps absorbing the sovereign debt. I mean, I don't think that's yet. I mean, there's a bunch of people who would like that to be true because it relaxes fiscal constraints and lets them get on with their agenda, whatever it is. And some of it's important, like public sector investment, building infrastructure, etc. So I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but I think this is probably not right. So you can either, Rudai, say a little bit more about this. I mean, I can tell you, I think that the velocity of money has fallen steadily over time. And a lot of the liquidity has flowed into the system and basically got built into other asset prices. So, depending on where you are, asset prices are pretty frothy. And if we start withdrawing that liquidity, that, we'll get the opposite of pretty frothy fairly quickly, I imagine. But let me stop there. Is there some aspect of this that I missed? Because I didn't completely understand the question, wherever you are. I can't see you either, so.
Yeah.
Well, it's getting late there, so maybe you've all gone to dinner.
No, I'm here, Mr. Spencer.
Yeah, oh, there you are. Good. Yes.
What I actually meant was, the U.S. government, in order to compensate the U.S. citizens about, the lack of employment, the unemployment rates, and the AIDS.
Yeah.
A lot of money were printed, and
No, I mean, depends on what you mean by printed. There's a lot of government debt. Is that what you mean?
I'm not sure if it is debt or
Yeah, it's debt.
printed from nothing. At least that's what I read a couple of days ago.
No, that's government debt, and most of it, of a significant increment that went with the pandemic response to buffer the shock, is held by the central bank. They're only starting to, they only started relatively recently to taper those purchases, right? So that's different than the government, just sort of running huge deficits and printing money, which is where you get hyperinflation pretty fast. So I don't think we did that. I'm not saying what we did didn't have its risks associated with it. I mean, including fragility associated with high debt or some loss of confidence in the system, or, as Raghuram Rajan said when asked, when does this end? Are there any limits to this? Or could we just have the central bank keep, intermediating the absorption of government debt? And he said, yeah, it stops when people don't think they're going to get paid back. I mean, essentially. And, but I think in this case, what you've got is a fairly, at least since the great financial crisis, a fairly classic case of the government running up debt and the central bank enabling it.
However, there is a slight rise in the U.S. economy's inflation, isn't it?
Oh yeah, slight is a bit of an understatement. Yes.
The highest.
So that is the central question, right? So that inflation rate, at least initially, is a function of the supply chain, demand supply mismatch, and we don't really understand this because there's no comprehensive view of it, but it appears there's significant changes in behavior on the supply side of the labor market, right? People are quitting, they're not coming back. There's stunningly high turnover numbers, and people are starting to try to understand it. I mean, but in the pandemic, a lot of people worked under very stressful and dangerous conditions, and a lot of them are just saying enough, and that includes doctors who are retiring, nurses. There's people on, if you make it global, there's people on ships, ocean shipping, who couldn't get off. What's going on here? Sorry, who couldn't get off the ship because no port would let them off because of the pandemic restrictions. Drives me nuts. They wouldn't let them off, so they're stuck on the ship for 9 months before they got home. And I think a number of those people have just said, well, that's not the job I want anymore. Enough, right? Well, if you write that script on a sufficiently large scale, and you've got a pretty major change in the economy. And so I think what the Fed is starting to realize now that we've got inflation running at 5 or 6%, is, can we really stick with this? It's transitory story. And I mean, the last round, Chairman Powell essentially signaled that they couldn't stick with it. They're changing. Now, what they're actually going to, but so what will they do? They'll slow the asset purchases a lot faster than they planned, but they'll probably have interest rate increases next year as well. So that looks like where we're headed. And that will slow the economy down, and it will probably have an impact on asset prices, risk assets in the United States. I've asked a lot of people, whether we're going to have a taper tantrum, right? Another one. Like the United States interest rates go up fairly fast, and then everything comes flooding back in the way it did when Chairman Bernanke announced that we're going to taper the asset purchases that came with quantitative easing. And there was a kind of convulsion in the global financial systems and money racing around. And people say, no, there's less risk of that, but I'm not. This is in the plumbing of the global financial markets, and I'm not. I'll tell you why they believe that. They believe it because there's enough liquidity out there, to replace any kind of flows like that, that it's not going to produce a systemic crisis of some kind. I hope that's right. But yeah, anyway, I think that's where we are. We definitely have inflation. The question is, if we just sit on our hands, how long will it last? And, and because it hurts poor people, if it lasts a long time, you can do a fair amount of damage. I mean, the real interest rates are negative, but also people are, their real incomes are falling as well, or at least a subset of people. I mean, and it's not all bleak. There is some pattern of, rising wages and incomes in the lower part of say the bottom half of the income spectrum as a result of these new economic conditions. And that's a good thing. At least most of us think it's a good thing. Let's see. Can we talk about a growing regionalization of the world economy? Yep, we can do that. So I think there's two forces that have led us. So there is more regionalization. Some of them are very fundamental. I mean, if you go back long enough in time and look at global supply chains, basically the manufacturing was in one set of countries and the demand was in another. So these supply chains were pretty simple. You make the stuff in country A and ship it to country B, where B meant the developed countries mostly, and A meant the countries that were at that time in the early stages of growth and didn't have enough demand. That's a completely inaccurate description of the status quo now, right? The aggregate demand in the global economy, consumption, middle classes, investment, big important investment programs, they're all over the world. And so the trade patterns and supply chains reflect that. One trend that you probably will have noticed is that the fraction of, the ratio between global trade and global GDP kept rising for a long period of time, like 2 or 3 decades. And after the great financial crisis, it flattened out and even started to decline. This is manufacturing, right? Not trade and services, which is growing very quickly and behaving completely differently. And we don't measure it very well either. But in manufacturing, goods trade, that pattern is true. And a significant part of that was that China was still manufacturing a lot, but because their market had become large relative to the rest of the world, larger, they were shipping it to themselves, right? And then that automatically lowers that ratio. So I think that's one element. It's just kind of big structural trends in the global economy. And if you can think of it as the rise of the developing world, the emerging markets, the shift to Asia and so on. Beyond that, I think you will see more regional trade. And at least the growth patterns or the trade patterns that I've seen, you're already seeing it. And it's partly related to what we just talked about, right? So you'll see a huge amount of global trade within Asia, right? Because they're big markets, right? And they're going to be producing for their markets. And then so we'll look like anyway, you'll see, same idea, you'll see it. You're already seeing it. And then when you add to that sort of trade tension, so some tendency to balkanize aspects of the global trading system or the global financial system, and we don't know how that's going to go, but it's not going very well right now. With the kind of China-US tensions being kind of front and center, but by no means the whole whole story, then that will further push you in the direction of the regional trade. So, there'll be comprehensive regional, economic partnership agreement in Asia with China in it. You have, the trade agreement the United States was supposed to be part of, among the, a subset of Asian nations that's in place. These are regional, and without blaming anybody. I mean, the WTO is important, but it's struggling right now for kind of relevance, unless we kind of work hard to shore it up. I think that's important, but anyway, that's the direction we're going. What we don't know what the digital will do. Its impact is mainly domestic right now, but not entirely. But we could have, there's a scenario you can imagine seeing as the world becomes essentially connected, in which a fair amount of trade and services runs on, huge platforms that span country boundaries. I mean, I can see that happening, but there's about 150 issues that have to be solved, like taxation, right? Who do you tax? Where? I mean, it's there's some really kind of conceptually difficult issues before we get to that point. And then, not to mention data. I mean, one of the trends that we're undergoing now is countries are starting to realize that their security, as they see it, depends on having data about their own economy and their own citizens resident physically in the country, and not cross borders, right? So, I haven't seen a definitive study of what the long run economic impacts of that if it becomes the standard practice, but we're moving in that direction. But it can't be more integration, at least for sure. So, what else? Yes. Yasmin?
Yes, thank you. I want to ask, we partially, I think, get used to working online, partially or fully. And
Yep.
You talked about the artificial intelligence, so some things are really changing. Do you think we will have a permanent different definitions about the labor supply later on? We can talk about different definitions of jobs or any categories in labor supply market.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think we will. I'm not sure how that will go. I mean, it's pretty easy to see a scenario. I went back and looked at the data for a number of economies in terms of hours worked. There's some variation across economies. So, this is probably related to kind of culture and values, but the trends over long periods of time are just declining hours of work. So it's very easy, if things go well, to see a scenario in which people work a smaller amount every week, and it's very easy to see a scenario in which they work different ways. Now, whether that blurs in some kind of fundamental sense the line between work and something else, I don't know what to call it, minding your own business, leisure, doing something that entertains you or something, I don't know. If that line gets blurred, then we have to address the question, so exactly how is your income determined, and that's important. But it's a little hard to kind of see that. But those other trends, it's easy to imagine. I don't share. I think a minority of people who think about this think, and this is not a new idea. I mean, there's been numerous versions. Keynes, Leontief, thought some of the technologies were going to be so powerful there wouldn't be enough jobs to go around. Well, I think there's adjustment mechanisms for that, and we tend to underestimate what new jobs will be created, and add those adjustment mechanisms, and overestimate the things that we know are probably going to disappear, like filing clerks and whatnot. I don't really think we're gonna have a bumpy, difficult transition in which some people will get sideswiped. But I don't think we'll find ourselves in a situation where we're kind of short of employment. Will all work be rewarding? I can imagine a scenario in which it is, right? I mean, this kind of gets us deep into this, but automation 1.0 was basically programmable computers replacing routine jobs. And routine jobs meant that we knew not only how to do something, but we knew exactly how to say the steps that we need to take to do it, right? And that was kind of, so routine and essentially meant codifiable in the sense of software, right? And it had a very big impact. I mean, the studies at MIT and others say we took a lot of routine jobs out of the economy. And we see it all around us. I mean, a younger generation won't probably see how we used to operate. I mean, when I was an assistant professor, every 2 young assistant professors had a secretary. I mean, that idea is just laughable now. We don't need them, but things like that were a lot of quite early entry stage or middle income jobs. Those people, they were mostly, but not all, women. They went on to careers in various things, back to school, advanced degrees, etc. But anyway, all that stuff is gone, and that had a big impact. And probably the distributional effects of that, based on studies by David Autor and others, were bad. Meaning, those jobs disappeared, and some people managed to get further up in the income distribution, but a subset got pushed back the other way. Right? This is called job and income polarization, and it's pretty well documented. I mean, its severity is different as you cross economies, but it's pretty well documented, at least for the developed economies, the higher income ones. The second round of automation is going to be different, right? Because it's not, I mean, the breathtaking, so what was the blockage in AI? I guess is the simplest way to say it. The blockage in but we have no artificial general intelligence and no agreement about when it's coming. The experts were asked in a kind of book that I read, written by Martin Ford. He went to the 50 people who were leading the charge in artificial intelligence and asked them a bunch of questions. And one was, when will we have artificial general intelligence, and where artificial general intelligence means a machine acts like us, switches domains easily, knows when somebody's talking about flowers and another person talking about spreadsheets. The AIs can't do that. I mean, they don't even have a chance, right? That's general intelligence. The answers that came back were anywhere from 10 years to never. So I think you can reasonably conclude that we don't have a clue when that will happen. But the big breakthrough was that there are a lot of things that people do as part of their jobs that have the property that we do them easily, learn how to do them somehow, but we don't know, we cannot describe precisely how we do them. So if you try to code people tried this, tell a computer how to recognize a cat or a chair. And by and large, it fails. I mean, people tried it and it didn't work very well. And the modern version of AI was said, well, okay, we're going to give up on that. And then we're going to let the machine figure it out. Can you still hear me? Because my iPod.
Yeah.
And we'll just let them, there's these, deep neural networks. This is pattern recognition of a very sophisticated kind, well beyond traditional statistics. But basically, they look at millions and millions of images and figure out, what the patterns are. And, human beings don't have to look at a million images. So there's kind of an interesting scientific question is, so
how did we get programmed to do it, when we're children relatively efficiently, and a machine has to, has this brute force method. But anyway, that's how they do it. And that looks to me to be much more egalitarian with respect to which jobs are affected. Not only which tasks will be taken over by machines, but the fact that, a lot of people are going to have super powerful digital assistants, right? Doctors, pick anything you want, teachers, people who do research like all of you. It won't take forever to produce machines where you basically say, go find out about something or other, and it comes back, 4.5 seconds later with what you wanted. And when I say super, I mean, these are superhuman. There's certain things these machines do, just better. Like take a doctor. Doctors are just overwhelmed by the amount of literature there is. And what they really need is an assistant that reads the literature, quote unquote, reads the literature, and finds the 5 articles this specialist really needs to see this month. Okay? And machines do that at light speed. Takes us forever, and we get tired and finally give up and whatnot. So that we're going to have that all over the place. But it seems to me that, that's not just middle income folks, right? That's all of us, regardless of where we sit. I mean, we could go on about this, but, the place where automation or machines replacing people will come last is in unstructured environments. So Kai-Fu Lee says, and it's not completely correlated with income. So Kai-Fu Lee wrote this influential book on, sort of AI competition between China and the United States, says, the last person to be put out of business will be your gardener. Because it's really complicated. It's not hard for a human being, but there's tree roots and lots of places to trip. And, we're an awfully long way from having a robot be able to do that. So anyway, I mean, I think, the general outlines of how this is going to go are sort of coming into focus, but nobody really knows or knows how fast. And then, and then there's this huge big issue about what's a responsible management of big data? How do you detect biases in it? If it's based on humans, I mean, if the training data set was what human beings did, the AI will just import them all, whatever biases were built into that. And now the question now that is challenging developers of these things is, so is there a way to weed that out, get rid of it? And actually make this thing better in that respect than maybe certain kind of human-based institutional systems. But that's a work in progress. I mean, I don't think that's viewed as anything like a solved problem. But I think that's kind of where we are. I mean, I'll say one other thing, because it's a fascinating set of questions. I mean, once you get past the sort of clunky version of what's happening to work, like there aren't enough jobs or these people will be banished to the desert or something. We had an industrial revolution. People stopped doing certain things like digging trenches because backhoes did them. Harnessing energy essentially. We had mechanization. For the most part, we never had automation. That is, we never replaced people in controlling the way the system worked, right? So there's a kind of information control transactions layer of an economy that's a little hard to describe. And that was never automated until now. And it's only partially automated now, but it's really the programmable computer that introduced, and now the internet and the World Wide Web and algorithms and this and that, and the digitalization of virtually all information is that we have real powerful patterns of automation in the information and control or decision-making or coordination. I mean, people have different names for this, but everybody vaguely knows what we're talking about. And the reason we know what we're talking about is most of us, on this call live in that part of the world. We don't actually mostly make stuff. We process information. And so in that sense, this is a new world, and probably we need to be pretty humble about A, predicting how it's going to go, and B, overuse of historical analogies, even though they're important and interesting. Let's see.
Thank you very much.
So I think Professor James Galbraith was raising hand, but now.
Oh, is there? Oh, sorry.
Professor Galbraith, yes.
Oh, James?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't mean to interlope here, but and my comment has been somewhat overtaken by the conversation, but we were talking earlier about inflation.
Yeah.
And just a couple of observations about that in the United States. One is that the news reports, which get repeated every month, are all based upon inflation over a 12-month period. And the press simply reproduces that observation. Well, what actually happened all occurred in March, April of this year. And it was basically two things. One was a big increase in energy prices. It's about 50% at least. Yeah. And the other was an increase in the price of used vehicles, which we know to have been because of the semiconductor shortage, which interrupted the production of new cars. So the price of used cars went up. Right. The second issue will resolve itself. The first has already basically been resolved by release of reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and you can see that gas prices are coming down. So most likely thing about inflation is that once March, April drop out of the data, which will happen in March of April of next year, I predict, scientists tell me that this will be the case, that the inflation numbers will recede. And one hopes that this happens before the Fed moves strongly, because they'll just make the problem worse if they do. But if the timing's just perfect, we'll have a situation where Jerome Powell can declare victory, and this will be the George Aiken solution for the Vietnam War: declare victory and go home. If we don't get there, we don't work out, it could end up being quite problematic coming in next year.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it'd be nice if it kind of receded just in time, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Good, excellent. Thanks, James.
Sure.
Let's see. Did Anil go somewhere? He wanted to ask.
I think there's no other questions in the chat box.
Okay, no, that's true. There's no other, but there was one question where one intervention we deferred, right? And I don't see him. No. Okay.
So I think
I get to let you go to dinner.
Professor Ali Khan. Yes, he had to left, I think. He is not with us now.
Yeah.
So
no, well, thank you all for having me. I enjoyed it. Does anybody know what the picture behind me is? So I'll give you a hint. That big lump at the bottom is Cuba. Nope. It's the Bahamas. Anyway, just thought I'd tell you.
Okay, thanks for sharing.
All right.
Okay, then I think there's no another question. Actually,
oh, here's one. Oh. The plan for the Bay of Pigs. Right. Yeah. No.
There are some questions in YouTube, but they are also partly answered. And I think to answer all of them, we have at least 2 hours more. So that's why I think we can finish it now. So
okay.
It takes about your 2 hours. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil.
Spence. So
it's a pleasure being with you. Thank you, Sam.
The final.
What?
So you want to say something for closing?
No, I just say thank you. And And I wish you all well for the holidays, but especially for your important research. The next time we meet, I hope we're sitting in the same room. So
Yeah.
thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy
very
New
much.
Year.
Happy New Year too.
Happy New Year.